we have like a new mic setup, but it's not. I didn't make sure we actually had it ready for today.
Danny, it's all your fault.
I know. I'm so sorry.
So, welcome. This is the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 59. Today, we're going to be talking about web virtual reality and augmented reality. We have some experts here, and on our panel, we have Daniel Blue
Hey, everybody.
and Justin Ribeiro,
Hello, wonderful people.
myself, Eric Isaacson, and we have Brandon and Joshua. Can you guys kind of tell a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in web VR and AR?
Alphabetical order, Brandon, you want to go first?
Sure, why not? Getting involved in VR in general, I think, like a lot of people, like the idea of VR has been something that's been, you know, a fantasy of mine for a while. You've got a lot of it in pop culture and whatnot, and that's just been something that's been an interest for me since I was younger. And I think, a lot of people could say the same thing, but to get down to the nitty-gritty of why I got into web VR specifically is I held off on the first round of Kickstarters from Oculus. I got a shirt, but I didn't actually get the DK1. But I got to play around with it, a couple of them, the first time around, and then when the DK2 was announced, I just made this impulse buy right then and there. I'm like, I have to have one of these. Let's go. And so I clicked the buy button and then sat back and said, I just spent $350 on a gadget. I should probably do something with it. And, at the time I was working on Chrome and still am. And it felt like kind of a natural thing to bring the web and that together because that was my comfort zone. And then fortuitously, a couple months later, I think Vlad started posting on Twitter about how he was integrating his DK1 with Firefox, and it was going rather well. And that sparked my interest. I started talking with him about it, and kind of the rest is history from there.
We have to get in later, Brandon, into the background of yourself and Vlad as like two of the guys who've been pushing high performance 3D in the web for a couple of years because I think it's significant the people who chose to get into this. My background was somewhat more. I come at it from more of a design perspective, where for many years I did 3D graphics, visual effects, motion graphics, a lot of design, and I kind of put that aside a couple of years ago to get much more into interaction design. I always tried to learn a new field. And so I was the lead interaction designer at Firefox OS for a couple of years. I came to Mozilla to do that, and I learned a lot about the web and the process of trying to make a web-based operating system. But after a couple of years of that, after 3 years of really intense work, it's time to kind of find something new, and I was looking for something fun. I was intent on surfing couches in British Columbia with my friends and getting back into architecture. And then the DK2 or the DK1 dropped, and John Carmack left id to go join Oculus. And when John Carmack leaves anything to join something, you pay attention to that. And then I read Michael Abrash's notes, I think from a conference, and he explained to me what presence was and how we'd kind of broken the presence barrier, and you could do it for a couple $100. And I'm like, okay, this sounds like it could change the world, especially once it miniaturizes and gets much more cheap. And I'm like, okay, well, this sounds pretty amazing. And now I know the web, and I know 3D, and this hardware is available now. Like, wouldn't it be fun to actually go out there and try and combine these things? And I bumped into our CTO at the time, Andreas Gall, and he said, yeah, you know who else asked me about working on that? Vlad Vukicevic, 3 days ago. He invented WebGL. You guys should talk. So Andreas gets out his phone and makes a phone call, and within, honestly, a 45-second conversation, it kind of came together about last May in the halls of Mozilla in Mountain View. It was kind of just freak occurrence, and it worked out really well. And since then, I've been kind of riding the technical coattails of Vlad and Brandon, who have been publishing WebVR API spec. And implementing into experimental builds of Firefox and Chromium WebVR support. And then what I do is, as a designer, developer, I take it and I just now with a team that's kind of, we've added a couple more people, are just trying to experiment with what do developers want? What do people want to do with WebVR? What's fun? And what are some of the basic usability and interaction patterns of WebVR? I mean, there's just so much to be done. And we've been at it for about a year now, since about, I guess last May or June, I'd say.
That's awesome. So where I kind of want to start is, so All right, so I'm a big nerd. I've read Ready Player One. I've watched all of Carmack's keynotes and stuff when he first started talking about these things and the weird prototypes he was building. So I think I have a pretty good understanding of what VR is. So, but what exactly is web VR? Is it the same? Is it the same thing? Is it just virtual reality websites, or is it a different experience altogether?
It's VR on the web. Next question.
I think it will be. I mean, it'll be interesting. It'll be different than native in some really interesting ways, in all the ways that the web is different from native. Your ability to go anywhere from anywhere, just via a link, not having to install content to do so. Probably large volumes of small units of information is kind of what the web is good at. Not these kind of. I always compare, like, the web reminds me of a plate of rice, and native kind of reminds me of steaks. A native, like, these apps are like extraordinarily expensive, and they're very fancy and they're very rich, and you kind of can't consume that many in a single sitting because you just would pass out and your home screen gets bloated. But the web, it's good at, like, there's a steady stream of little bits of information, whether it's kind of piped in by an API or just, it's billions of sites on Wikipedia. So what I'm really excited about actually is the notion of web VR content consumption that looks like me surfing from little piece of information to piece of information to piece of information kind of seamlessly via links in virtual reality. So that's one thing. And I think what's interesting too about the experience of web VR will be its universality. I mean, early VR is unbelievably fragmented, and actually I find it extraordinarily exciting that you have the Cardboard play, the Morpheus play, the Vive play, the Oculus play. They really could not be more different from each other. Maybe Vive and Oculus are similar, but you've got like console gaming, mobile, and you've got like desktop PC gaming, and they're all trying to attack the same market from very different economic and technical angles. The downside of that, of course, for users is that maybe you can't have a shared experience with a friend who owns a Vive if you own a Cardboard, for example. One of the hopes I have for WebVR is that because it runs in any WebGL-enabled browser, that we can really kind of have shared experiences that transcend any one platform. And then even transcend having HMD. The notion that I can have a shared experience with someone who just has an old Mac or has a mobile phone, and we can be at the same URL seeing different views of the same experience is extraordinarily exciting to us. The one that, well, we talked about this a little bit, but I imagine a site where I'm in VR and I'm like in a big concrete plane, and my friend at a keyboard is a cruel typographic god, and any letter that she types manifests itself as a giant block that plummets into the ground and smashes in front of me, and I can have this really neat shared experience that transcends just what I can see alone in VR and in the headset. So I think there's going to be some really, really, really cool, unique aspects to WebVR. They're going to make VR as a whole much richer. By the way, I don't think it's either or. I think it's like WebVR is going to help make VR better in general.
Josh, your answer was much longer than Brandon's.
Yes, it was, and I actually wanted to go back to like Josh is great about the design side of this. To touch on the technical side really quick, just to be clear for anybody who's not familiar with it, WebVR is, in technical terms, like giving your browser the ability to actually render a scene through your VR headset that completely encompasses you, like any of the native VR experiences that you might have seen or heard of. Like we want to be able to do that through, say, WebGL. We want to be able to enable you to create content through CSS and the DOM and have floating elements in space like that. But yeah, it is fundamentally something where we're trying to allow you to create a virtual environment that completely surrounds you, that gives you presence, believability through the web. It's not necessarily just like a version of your web browser that floats in space on a 2D quad. I think that will be part of it as well, because there's going to be a lot of reason for you to want to jump back and forth between virtual environments and kind of these quote-unquote legacy 2D environments of the web. There's a lot of information to still be had there. But yeah, from the technical side, that's what we're talking about.
Mm. Then maybe, I mean, I don't want to divert, but one of the things I think is really special about now is that we're kind of in a moment in time on the web where the web is getting really fast at 3D, like really fast at 3D. I struggled for a couple of years to try and get 60 FPS smooth scrolling on like a 100 email inbox on a 3.5-inch screen on a kind of a low-end mobile device. That's hard. But meanwhile, people like Brandon and Vlad at initiatives like the Games Initiative at Mozilla have been really pushing this notion of high performance 3D graphics on the open web. The only reason that my team and I can play with virtual reality headsets plugged into browsers and get acceptable performance is because of the work that people like Brandon have been doing for the last couple of years to make high performance 3D in the browser feasible. And there's some really, really exciting stuff coming down the pipeline that he can probably speak to much more ably. But I think one thing I want people to kind of take away from this is that the web, and especially in terms of 3D, is getting really, really fast. Your notion of what a website is probably needs to be updated for most people, but I don't think that's really broken through the mind share of most developers quite yet. But I think we're going to see that happen maybe in the next year.
With so much of the technical side being a hurdle, like we talk about, there are so many competing platform sort of devices between Cardboard and Oculus and everything else. Is that configurability problematic? Because the nice thing about the web is the web generally just works. Are we going to have a situation where we need more APIs in the web just to figure out exactly what device people are using? Do we want them to go through that, selection metaphor of which device are you using? Now load this, and then it's going to load this. Like, how are we going to overcome that sort of technical / user experience design problem that we're going to have?
If you don't mind, I think that for one, it's a bit of it's papering over the actual problem to say that the web kind of works anywhere, because it does within limits. We've been at a state for several years now where you've got two really big primary ways of consuming the web, which is either your desktop or your mobile device. And we've gradually worked our way to a point where you can consume most content on either device, and the form factor will be a little bit different, but generally you can get the same information from the same sites. But that certainly was not always the case, and it is definitely still a struggle for people to make sure that you're working in all of the different ways that the web can be consumed. If you don't build your site with mobile devices in mind, it will be a terrible experience on mobile devices. In some cases that's actually justified. Like I look at ShaderToy, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a great site that may or may not crash your browser. That it allows people to do WebGL shaders just kind of on the fly. It's everything on the site is a shader. It's just two triangles that run some computation on every pixel, and they do incredible effects with it. If you're not familiar with it, you just got shadertoy.com. You just got to go see it. This is something that if it happens to work on your mobile device, then great, that's bonus. But that's not what people there are aiming for. They're trying to push the GPUs to their limits. And so taking that perspective and applying it to the VR space, you should be able to absolutely build something that works on both a Cardboard all the way up to an Oculus CV1 or a Vive or whatever the latest and greatest is going to be at the time. But you do have to keep in mind the limitations of each of those devices, or else you're going to end up with a really crummy experience on one of them, whether that be graphics or input or what have you. And I do think that we're going to maybe need to provide some tools to allow you to gauge what the capabilities of those platforms are in respects to VR a little bit better. Do I have full 6-degree freedom gamepads that I can hold in my hands, or just a little magnet button? But we can the developers need to be aware of the differences and code towards the audience that they expect to attract.
If I may too, what's interesting is we're not alone in this on the web. There's initiatives like OSVR, and even prior to that, like VRPN, who have dealt with the same problem and tried to actually provide somewhat common interfaces to kind of a really diverse array of interesting devices that are constantly coming out. So it may be that we can get some help from those quarters as well. And just to your point, try to make the web as plug and play as possible within some constraints.
Cool. So my next question is kind of towards design and towards the technical side, a big problem that VR has had up to this, not a problem, like a lot of things do it very well now, but motion sickness is a genuine problem when you are designing and developing VR software. Are there any specific are there any technical challenges or design challenges that are specific to the web to deal with things like motion sickness? Because people generally now don't get motion sick browsing a website, and if you could build a website that makes people throw up.
Mm-hmm.
To reiterate, are there design things or technical considerations that have to be made to help avoid some of those problems?
I'll let Josh tackle the design side, but on the technical side, what we're working on right now primarily is just getting the browsers to the point where they can really consistently put out the frame rates needed at the latency needed in order to run these things. And that is a bit of a technical challenge simply because up until this point there hasn't been any realistic need for a browser to output frames at 90 hertz under 20 milliseconds latency. That just hasn't been a technical requirement. And unless you're actively working towards requirements like that, they're not going to happen. So we're playing catch up now and saying, all right, what do we need to change about the browser to get under these technical limits that we know are needed for a good VR experience. And I firmly believe that it can happen, and the only reason that we're not there yet is because traditionally that hasn't been a requirement. But beyond that, I think the web is absolutely capable of doing it, and it comes down to design issues, which are, I don't believe that they're unique to the web, and maybe Josh can talk some more about this, but we're talking about design issues that everyone in the VR space is generally facing right now. So.
Yeah, if you want to have a fun conversation on web VR UX, like think about pop-up blockers and trackers and cookies and how we can manifest those in VR. We're gonna have a lot of fun designing web VR. I think I try and get it across to my design friends. I'm like, you've been magazine designers for your whole career, and now you will be unto gods creating like amazing, beautiful, awesome worlds. And then conversely, the browser vendors will have to empower the user with some pretty gnarly tools. Like one of my favorite is like the geometry occlusion zone, whereby a site shall not render itself within 10 feet of me unless I grant it like a personal proximity permission, which enables it to actually render closer to me. And until that actually happens, there's like a force field in front of me, whether it merely obscures the content behind it, or whether it actually like occludes the geometry in some fashion. I think that because on the web we tend to go through so many sites, and because those sites can sometimes make very bad design decisions about things it wants to throw up in your face, and because VR is such a powerful medium, I think you're going to get some really, really interesting sort of like evolutionary arms races going between content creators and then users who want to kind of have an experience that they find to be pleasant. One other challenge maybe is going to be that I don't think we think a lot about this, but when you teach someone to use the web, once they learn how to click on a blue link, they know how to use the web pretty much. And so that's kind of the magic of the web, is that every site functions very consistently. And every site gets a scroll bar for free. You don't have to actually implement your own scrolling mechanism on a site-by-site basis. It's just provided to you by the user agent. Insofar as WebVR is largely WebGL, or eventually things like WebAssembly, that's probably going to go away. And so you may have a situation where every site you go to has quite a different input method, quite a different input scheme, or at least it's based on common conventions. It's not based on something the user agent actually consistently provides. So that'll be interesting. It may actually increase the learning curve of different sites significantly, and that may make it less friendly to people who don't have our like hellaciously geeky enthusiasm for understanding new control schemes as you go from place to place to place. So that's, I think, maybe an unintended consequence we'll have to think about. That maybe is an argument in favor of a more declarative web VR based on HTML and CSS.
Yeah, and if you think about, Eric, I know you have a question next, but I think a good parallel to draw is when first-person in video games, first-person shooters as we know them now, most of them have pretty much the same control scheme. If you go back about a decade or so, when the idea of the first-person shooter on console exists now, there were a ton of different there were a ton of different button placements, and like how you would bring up the iron sights, what was the reload button. Now everybody has pretty much agreed. But so what it sounds like is that we're about to be in that place now where people are going to have to figure out how this is going to work, and everybody's going to come up with their own. There's no style guide yet for how to build this stuff out.
Yeah, exactly. And you're not going to get very much for free from the browser if you go the WebGL route. The user's experience of this, especially the less technically savvy user, is going to be, I think, a series of experiences you're hopping between that could all be very, very different from one another. We've seen some interesting early attempts to do kind of quasi-web VR that have actually, by restraining the creators to a narrow set of building blocks, have actually kind of have managed to avoid this. So Janus is interesting, where Janus VR, if you're not familiar with it, you basically have like XML syntax and the custom elements, and you kind of, not really custom elements, but like XML elements you can define, like wall, floor, these kind of things in markup in a declarative way. And then XML, or Janus, the actual user agent, will actually render these and do things like render links as doorways. And you click on the door, you can see the next world beyond it, and it kind of does perspective matching as you tilt your head back and forth. It's pretty neat stuff. And so they resolved this by actually having it is a more declarative approach, I suppose. And they kind of have more of a they impose a certain like consistent look and feel on the creators, which as a result is good for usability. If it's maybe a little bit less liberating or creatively freeing for content creators.
Yeah, I think that there's an interesting parallel to draw there to, like, say, Minecraft. Minecraft is wildly successful, I believe, specifically because it is restrained. You can't, go and script every last element in there. And I mean, people mod it and whatnot, but the core gameplay is actually fairly restricted. You get a very specific tool set, and then people do incredible things with it. And it's because that initial step into that world is much more palatable because everybody understands the basic building blocks that they have. So I think that there's definitely an argument to be made for, yes, continuing to have like the low level, I can script it all myself, style of developing for these things, but then also having either libraries or conventions or whatnot that provide those perhaps more limited building blocks as something that's more palatable to the average developer.
Definitely. As far as the design goes and the UX, that's been pretty core, as you guys said. So I've been playing with the Project Tango development kit recently, and there's two different ways you can do that. You can use the Java or Android rather, or you can use the Unity. And so one of the things I noticed about a lot of the things that I downloaded was that there's a lot of the same type of applications like for VR, and the UX as far as like you have to use your eyes to look at things. So when you're moving your head, it sees where the center point is, and then you can actually, once you hit something, then fireworks will go off on one of them, and different types of interactions that you wouldn't even think of. Like, I was a little confused at first when I saw this, but then it was a common thing among all of these different applications. One of the things I struggle with, though, in that is trying to figure out what the best practices are in designs, is that the hardware sometimes is sometimes it'll power down, the battery is not so great, I'll use the tools to try and do a 3D rendering of a room in my house, let's say, and which is pretty awesome to be able to do, but I typically don't get far enough to have a full rendering before it'll shut off, and that particular app will crash. What are the ways that we can, help to forward a lot of these this software? Because I know it's not easy to do. It reminds me of like when I was on 486 machine trying to work with 3D Studio Max and then rendering with Radiosity. If you're familiar with that, that's when the light bounces off of all the objects in a 3D scene and you create this realistic type of look. It would take 45 minutes sometimes for a particular frame to render. And if you're doing 30 frames a second at that time, in a 486 machine, that's an old PC. I am dating myself now, but it's I wouldn't get further than a minute of stuff. Like, it just wouldn't happen. It would crash or it would turn off. I would have to spend days trying to render that, and that's what it kind of feels like now. What are the things that we can do to help alleviate a lot of those struggles?
So I want to put in a really, really quick plug, semi-unrelated, for the fact that if you happen to have a Project Tango device, one of the tablets, there is a WebVR build available right now. You can go through webvr.info and click on Chrome Builds link, and there's a special build just for Tango devices. I put together. That was actually really fun because I'd been pinged by the Tango guys, and they said, "Hey, we noticed that you're working on this API. It looks like it'll be a good fit for WebVR." And I said, "Well, great. Get me a dev device, and I'll make it happen." And then we had some partners that were coming in, and they wanted to test some web content with Tango. I said, "Well, what's the best way to do this?" And they had this WebSocket rig where there was a local server running on the Android device that would pump through these events and everything, and it was causing them some problems. And so it was really fun where they got me the device and said, "We need this like tomorrow." And I sat down and plugged in the API, and it worked really, really well. It mapped really well to what WebVR exposes, and I had a functional build like the next day. And it was cool to see how WebVR actually applied itself to that different environment, because Tango does not look at all like your normal headset, but it gives you back similar data. So rather than strapping something to your face, you can, I guess, but it's more common for people to be using it like this. But the same API has actually provided a really good entry point into that. And it enables you to build something that both works as a tablet, looking around like this, and as a headset, and so on and so forth. So anyways, I wanted to plug that build is available, and it's really interesting to see how
That's awesome. I am going to have to download that and play with it.
Maybe on the performance part of it, I think the web's gotten pretty good at tooling, insofar as we're really good at kicking out new tools and sharing those tools. I was joking the other day. When I wanted to name a project, I didn't check it against an available domain name. I checked it against an available npm name. So I have a lot of faith that you're going to see neat tools and frameworks pop up. And actually, we've already seen a couple of things like Glam, for example, from Tony Parisi, trying to make it relatively easy for someone to get started creating a 3D world, or WebVR scene. Boris Smuss from Google has created a pretty cool boilerplate that enables you to have responsive WebVR that works on mobile, desktop, and on VR devices. So web developers, bless them, are really good at sharing great tools, and so I hope it'll make it easier for people to create stuff, but also maybe on the performance side, we'll try to encapsulate best practices for performance standpoint, because certainly there will be some foot guns. It'll be really easy for you to make a scene that, to your earlier question, can make someone quite ill, or that just, if you try and, I don't know, throw like an 8K video up, it's just going to break. Like, certain things will break, right? So it'll be interesting to see kind of how we as a community figure out what those best practices are and figure out what the boilerplates and the frameworks and the templates that are the best are. And by the way, I think those as well will also encapsulate UX best practices. Like, if, for example, look-based cursor is the easiest thing for us to get started with, so then someone's going to release a look-based cursor as a library or as a framework that just gives you that for free.
Yes, one of the things that I found difficult to do is the discovery of these things. So I know that they exist because, there's the things that you guys are bringing up is like, oh wow, that exists. Like I thought it would be there, but I can't find it through a search. So can you guys add some of those links so our viewers will be able to do that? And of course, it's very selfish because I want to do it too. So I'd like to go through and look at the boilerplates, especially things like that.
Sure.
So that's pretty interesting with me. I would kind of expect a lot of things to break initially, but I want to be able to break those things and understand how they're breaking.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people want that at this point because many people would consider this very experimental.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, I think yeah, we're at an interesting phase right now where there's not a lot of consumers of VR out there, but there's a lot more creators. Like the creator-consumer balance is like wildly skewed in favor of creators, which is it's not usually how it is in most platforms. It's going to change really soon once Oculus and Vive and everyone starts shipping consumer hardware. But yeah, we're at an interesting point in time right now where it's just most of the fun to be had, I think, in WebVR and in VR in general is in making stuff, not necessarily in consuming stuff. I don't spend a lot of time with my headset on trying different applications and being way blown away. I spend most of my time on my headset like building my own stuff, and it's incredibly, incredibly addictive. Like I said before, like making virtual worlds, it's fun. It's just really, really, really fun.
Brings me back to my role-playing days.
One other thing to point out in relation to this is the web has already been through this cycle very recently with WebGL, where WebGL, and it ties in very closely with WebVR because there is a large portion of that that's going to be driven through WebGL. But WebGL was extremely experimental when it first came out. There was only a few browsers that could run it, and you had to go through a bunch of crazy steps to enable it. It's a very intimidating API. It's very difficult to actually start getting things on screen in a reasonable way, and it would. And at this point, WebGL is just an accepted part of the web. It's something that everybody can access. It's something that you're starting to see more and more uses from sites like the New York Times. They're using it for data visualization, which is great. And I very firmly believe that we would not have gotten there without the tooling that we have, very specifically without Three.js. Because you have this library that came along very early on, and it made it palatable. But it retained a lot of flexibility. And it's still what the majority of WebGL is built on today. And so, and it's not the only tool available, and there's other tools that complement it, and like the ecosystem has grown, but it's a really great example of how, the underlying tools, like the core WebGL API is very, very flexible, very unforgiving, and it's very intimidating. And then the community has really stepped up and provided the tools to allow more individuals to take advantage of that. And I think that we'll see the exact same thing with WebVR. And we're just at that early enough stage that the Three.js of WebVR hasn't yet emerged. Although the Three.js of WebVR may very well be Three.js. So we'll have to see.
Yeah, last week we had Sarah Swaydan on, and we were talking about SVG, and that was one of the things we brought up, like D3, was this very, very low-level API that made it easy to work with SVG, because it's a very, very difficult thing. And I had mentioned Three.js being sort of the 3D counterpart for that. And that's kind of how I see that. So because it's so low-level, I can totally agree that this would be able to be used as the boilerplate for WebVR, like the jQuery of it, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, Three.js is really, really good at composing scenes and making it understandable for how to do that. Probably what it's lacking in terms of VR specifically is assisting with some of those conventions that Josh was talking about earlier. And we don't even know what all those conventions are going to be yet, so it's appropriate that it doesn't have that. But we probably need something like Three.js that then has some WebVR specific, just nudges you in the right direction for that, for the right direction for how to build UI, or the right direction for how to rig cameras and do movement in a 3D space, and so on and so forth. And I firmly believe that will all come. It's just the industry as a whole is deciding what these conventions are right now.
Yeah, just to add to that, it would be a shame if you had to know Three.js to build WebVR, is the way I would put it. There's a lot of people out there who are never going to learn Three.js who would love to have the fun that I'm having, and I do know Three.js, building WebVR worlds. And I think that VR would be richer if we had more voices contributing lots and lots of interesting content. So I am very excited to see framework developers and people take the power of Three.js and make it a bit more accessible, or take the power of WebGL or WebVR in general and make it a bit more accessible. I think that'll come. We're at a point now, too, I mean, we haven't talked about this, but Oculus shipped last week their O.7 SDK, and their policy is going to be that your apps, if you're on O.7, your app will be compatible with O.7 and O.6 and O.1, are always the preceding version of the SDK. And we're going to go through kind of a certain period of churn in terms of just the SDKs we're running on top of until they get to their 1.0, and I think like November timeframe is what they've said. So there's just going to be like, when that happens, there's always a chance that Nightly could break. We've had some just regressions in our builds in the last couple of weeks. We've jumped on and fixed, but like for anyone who wants to get involved in this, there is going to be a period of churn, I think, probably right through to the end of the year, where just the APIs are changing. We don't know what the hardware itself is still kind of in flux in some cases. But it's actually kind of a good period for us because we can get those framework and tooling things sorted out. We can get some of the UX conventions sorted out, perhaps. We can get some of the browsers proper to actually integrate little niceties that make WebVR a bit easier to use for your average users, not having to configure their displays and things like that when they get started. And then maybe by the end of the year, once these devices start to ship to consumers, WebVR is in a good place. We've got the UX kind of sorted out. We've got the tooling ready. That, to me, is probably at a very high level, hand-wavy level, probably about the timeline I think we're looking at.
And on WebVR info, sorry, Brandon, like there is like a link to the GitHub for Mozilla, and it looks like it's a spec. So can you talk about that spec? Is it something that's just for Mozilla? Is it something for Firefox OS? Is it something that's going to be integrated hopefully into a broader range of specs, like maybe W3C or anything?
Yeah, the spec is hosted with Mozilla right now, but I've been contributing to it as well. It's not something that is just going to be implemented by Mozilla. We're all working towards the same goals here. I suspect that when we get to the point where we're really feeling comfortable with the API and that it's going to remain reasonably stable going forward, yeah, we'll start shopping it around and figuring out what the right working group is to give that a home. But right now, it's far more practical just to have it hosted with either Mozilla or Google, and Mozilla's kindly doing that, just so we can iterate really quickly. Because to Josh's point, if you haven't been doing native VR development, you'd probably be surprised at the amount of churn that the native SDKs are going through. I mean, since the DK2 came out, really, Oculus has been continuously, trying out certain methods, especially around display, like how you get images onto the headset. They've been trying out a method, and then a couple of SDK revisions later saying, no, we're going to pull that back and give you this one. We're going to try that out, and no, actually, we feel like this is going to work better. And they're very experimental, and they're willing to break things, and they're willing to drop entire features and add new ones. And it's great because they're at this period right now where they're just figuring out what works. Mm-hmm. And Valve is doing the same thing. And of course, because we are built on top of those APIs, we're out of necessity experiencing some churn there anyways. But then we're also trying to figure out, okay, how do we take these concepts and apply them to the web? And that's still very much in flux. There's been a lot of conversation recently about what's exactly the right mechanism for the developer to indicate, I want to show this content on the headset now, and what's the lifespan of that, and how does that interact when you're going between web pages, and how does the user control that, how does the developer control that, and so yeah, we need an environment where we can iterate quickly and not be too worried about breaking things, and not be too worried about getting sign off from larger working groups and whatnot. So it's a good place for it to be.
So have other companies reached out to you guys to help assist in this, and other browser vendors? Like, what's Edge's and Safari's take on it?
Nobody ever knows what Safari's take is on it until they release it. That's just.
I was hoping you'd tell me something different, but
no, that is Apple's thing too. I have actually heard murmurs from the Edge team that it's something that they're interested in. They're keeping an eye on it. I think that they're probably just waiting to make sure it stabilizes a little bit more. And I can't speak for what Microsoft is or isn't going to do, but at least I've heard some interest there. Obviously, Mozilla and Google are very interested in it. Opera at this point kind of just inherits whatever Google does by virtue of being based on Blink. And I guess that's really about it in terms of browsers.
Is it something on the Microsoft user voice?
It is on
I believe
Microsoft.
so, yeah.
You can go vote for it. And it's as I recall, it's had a decent showing so far, considering what a niche API it is at the moment. But yeah, I mean, it's worth considering. Nobody's actually released a consumer VR headset right now, unless you want to count Cardboard. But like the big ones, Oculus and Valve, they're still getting there. Sony's still getting there. It's difficult to ask a lot of large companies to make big bets on hardware that hasn't actually officially found a user base yet. So I think that once this hardware starts disseminating out to users, as it starts to get cheaper, as it starts to get more content for it, you will see interest in these things pick up.
And I'll say too that like a lot of the work that's being done, let's say, pardon me, on WebGL2, on SIMD, on WebWorkers, on WebAssembly, these things all naturally feed into what WebVR needs. And so even if they're not working on WebVR, if they're making 3D in the web faster, we're going to benefit from that. And then once maybe like Brandon and Vlad in particular lock in the behavior of the API, and we kind of ratify that, and we get it, two browsers are doing it really well, and maybe a year from now, like 6 months now, who knows, we'll be in a position to kind of, I think, it may be easier for teams like Edge to actually jump on this. I imagine in the case of the Edge team, they've got a brand new browser, and they've probably got their hands full with a lot of stuff. But I have heard that the WebGL performance of Edge is really, 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 really good. So that's a good sign.
Excellent. So we talked quite a bit about kind of the UX and the design of these experiences and how they're going to be different. We've talked about kind of the software side of things as well. We've mentioned Oculus and Morpheus and Cardboard and things like that. Is there going to be one of these devices, or maybe even a completely different device that you could dream up that would be best for something like WebVR? Like, is something like Cardboard or something a little bit more advanced than that does use your phone as the main device, is something like that more in line, or do you think a completely standalone thing, headset like Oculus or Morpheus is more the way that things are going to be going?
I think it'll come down less maybe to the hardware, more to the policies of the platform creators. Like, for example, Mozilla is about to ship an iOS browser, build of Firefox. It's going to run on WebKit. For a long time, we did not have a product on iOS because iOS does not allow us to actually ship a browser based on top of a non-WebKit render engine. In our case, Gecko. If, for example, Oculus was to say that thou shalt not ship an app in our store that does not run on top of WebKit, that would be problematic for Mozilla, right? It would not necessarily be a hardware thing. It would be more of a platform policy thing, I think. So, off the top of my head, I can't think of any hardware that would be better or worse for the web, except perhaps in terms of performance. But even on performance, there are still a lot of low-hanging fruit that we can be plucking to make web performance better. So I don't really think we've hit hard limits there. I don't know, Brandon, what do you think? Any hardware?
So to talk to your point about permissions, we are already kind of seeing this with the Gear VR, where Oculus has said that anything that goes onto the Gear VR in VR mode it has to go through their store and has to go through their approval process. Now, I firmly believe that if we came to them with a fully formed VR browser and said we want to put this on the store, they would be thrilled with it. But we don't have that right now. And to be clear, what I'm talking about is, in order to be on their platform, I think we would have to have a browser that you can operate completely within VR from end to end. And right now, WebVR does not do that. You have to navigate to a page normally, click a button, it starts up a VR experience, you close that down and navigate away. That's not going to work for something like Gear VR, which is a self-contained platform. And so, yeah, like obviously that's not a good platform for WebVR right now. Maybe it will be in the future. Like I think we'll eventually get to the point where we're using, we can view the web completely from within VR and be swapping back and forth from fully immersive environments to, quads in space. But that's going to take some time and some development and experimentation. I would say that right now, this very second, probably the best platform for VR is something like Cardboard, because everybody's got the hardware required for it, or you can get the hardware required for it very, very simply. And so, and it works well for that mode of slip the phone out, navigate, hit a button, view it for a little bit, and then slip it out again and move on. I think it will evolve over time to the point where, maybe you'll get a better experience out of like the Oculus or Valve headsets. Maybe we'll end up with, self-contained headsets that you want to just do this all in. It will evolve over time. But at this exact moment, I think that doing something like on a phone through Cardboard is probably the best bet for the average consumer.
Excellent.
Now, you talked a little bit about Facebook having to have this security block, like so that they'll actually go through all of the applications that go to their store, which is awesome. So what are some security vulnerabilities or
I think in their
gotchas
case,
that we need to think about?
I think in their case it's less about security; it's more about like quality. I think that they're very concerned with early VR having a bar of quality because VR is one of those crazy things where if you have a great experience, oh my God, it's transcendent. I mean, if you've tried the Vive demos, the Aperture Science demo for Vive is like life-changing. It is the coolest thing I have ever seen in my entire life. But if you don't have that level of quality, it can be a very negative experience for people. So I suspect that the review policies are more due to quality and perhaps due to like content. They're probably pretty gun-shy on adult content, for example, right? Yeah. So I don't think it's so much a security thing, but from a security perspective, I mentioned pop-up blockers. It's going to be really interesting to see what malicious parties on the open web do with the power of VR. There could be some pretty, the power of VR to kind of like cure trauma. You may have heard of this, to kind of cure PTSD or to cure people of phobias through exposure therapy. Can be used for evil as well, obviously. So I do get concerned about kind of malicious use of VR on the open web, and I think it'll be, again, I mentioned an arms race before. I think that there will have to be tools that are given to the user to help them, ensure their own comfort when they go from site to site to site. For things like automatically like muting a site as you come into it, or again that geometry occlusion zone. I think maybe not in the early days, but I think pretty soon you'll see tools like that pop up.
Everybody's familiar with, they're not so popular anymore, but like the Screamer videos where you start out with something that's like really quiet, or
yeah, totally.
And they throw up the terrible face and it's screaming, and everybody laughs because you get a video of somebody falling out of the chair.
Yeah.
Now, imagine that same experience in VR. Like, I think it was Carmack who said that we are eventually going to kill somebody in VR because we are literally going to give somebody a heart attack. Because like horror games, for whatever reason, I don't understand it, are so popular there. And so imagine like taking that same type of technique and putting it in VR, and then like giving this to the 4chan crowd or the Reddit crowd or something like that. That's going to be terrible.
Yeah.
It's going to be really scary stuff. And so we need to find ways to help users be protected from that if they choose to be. And I think part of it's going to be social convention. Like, we're already in a situation where the internet is completely full of porn, but you are capable of navigating through the internet without hitting porn if you don't want to find it. In most cases, everybody does this day to day, and that's largely because of social conventions that we've all kind of adopted around the web, and some tooling as well. Like the major search engines all put in a lot of work to make sure that unless you say you're searching for that, that's not what you find. And then we don't email that type of stuff to each other at work or stuff like that. So there's a lot of social conventions get built up around this. I think the same things will apply to VR. We'll just have to build up, some different variants of it. But there are definitely tooling and technical approaches that we can take to help protect people from the type of content they don't want to see in VR as well. Because there is definitely a heightened risk because of the immersive factor. And we don't want to sour people to it. So,
what about content? As far as I guess accessibility, but I don't know if it would be called the same thing. But content being accessible, basically, to people, like if you're reading a book in VR, something like that, and then you want the actual text to be transferred someplace. You have another window or something that you push it through. How is that? How does it handle accessibility and discoverability from the outside world?
So that'd be that'd be like a multitasking kind of scenario. It sounds like, or I guess it's kind of two things there. One's like kind of like a power user, maybe multi-window. I'm being productive in WebVR kind of scenario. And the other one I think is maybe is your classic accessibility scenario where it reminds me of the work Apple's done on the iPhone, on the iOS platform to make it accessible to the visually impaired people. Yeah, in terms of productivity, we've kind of, I think some people kind of looking at virtual desktop as an attempt to actually make your desktop render from Windows into virtual reality, which is interesting. I think until the device resolution gets a lot better and until the input paradigms begins to stabilize and we understand what the input peripherals are going to be, it's going to be in flux for a while. Like I think Carmack said you need 4K displays to make text really palatable in virtual reality. I often have this metaphor of you could go to the movie theater to read a book projected onto a big screen. Why the hell would you? Like you could read text in virtual reality, but you've got a really good Retina display in your pocket at all times, and you've got a really nice laptop with a really nice screen on it. Like, is reading text really going to be what makes what VR is going to be good for, or do you want to focus more on VR's ability to make you feel like you were in the Sistine Chapel or you're running from a dinosaur? Like that probably will be, I think, where there are more interesting use cases. The one thing I'll say on productivity for VR in general that I am looking forward to is, because VR has this infinite canvas, one can imagine having your Sublime editor superimposed over the thing you're actually working on, and be able to kind of lean around and walk around it and actually be typing and doing some really unbelievably cool content creation scenarios. Rift Sketch is a really awesome application where you can actually, with motion controllers, paint streaks of light in 3D space in a way that's really intuitive. Anyone can pick up, and it's quite magical and quite beautiful. I think like most things that when a new medium comes along, we inevitably we invent television and we point the cameras at radio hosts. It takes us many years before we invent reality TV, and The Sopranos comes along, and really killer applications of that technology actually begin to surface. I think in the short term you'll see some kind of awkward applications of kind of classic desktop mobile paradigms into virtual reality, and then inevitably we'll kind of, as a culture, through social convention, also just the creative experimentation, begin to figure out what the native uses of VR are going to be, and what the native VR productivity kind of use cases and scenarios actually look like. But I think it'll probably take a little while.
Yeah, I could totally see the way that we interface with computers in general to be affected by this. Yeah. So, you'd say that it's not an interesting use case for books, and I agree right now. But what's to say, that we don't have too many libraries anymore. So at one point, that might be something that people are doing all the time. Yeah. I'm going to go into virtual reality and read. It sounds weird now, but it's you don't know. We don't know in general.
Rainbow's End's got a great riff on that. If you guys have read it, but the virtual libraries, or it's a real world library, but it's been enhanced with an augmented mixed reality overlay, and it's very cool. It reminded me of that.
Definitely. Hey, I apologize, but I need to give up this conference room, so I will have to sign off now. It's been a great conversation. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for coming, Brandon. If people want to find you, what's your Twitter, and how can people help out?
Yeah, Twitter's a great way to get in touch with me. It's Tojiro, Tojiro, on Twitter. And yeah, feel free to ping me on there. I'm usually pretty responsive.
Yeah, and I'm just Josh Carpenter on Twitter as well.
All right, and people should go to webvr.info if they want to help or contribute.
There's also a good jumping off point. Yeah.
Okay. And there's also a mailing list on there people can subscribe to, I saw.
Yep.
All right. Well, thanks for coming. Is there any more questions before we all sign off?
Well,
All
thanks
right.
for having
Thank you
me.
so much for coming, guys.
Yeah, thank you for
Yeah,
having us, guys. That was awesome.
This has been awesome. And if you guys could just, when you get a chance, add those links and we'll put it on there.
Sure. Yeah, I'll drop a couple links today into the Google Doc.
You guys are awesome. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks, guys. Have a good day.
You too. Bye.